They say that when a mother loses her child, she loses a part of her soul. But what happens when the woman who stole that child years ago stands before you in your son's $1 million home, looks you straight in the eye and says, "You have nothing here"? I'm Evelyn Harper. I'm 72. I came to California to bury my son, and I never imagined that this trip would turn everything upside down. If you're reading this story for the first time, subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. Like and comment with the name of the city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far my story has traveled in the world. The morning Daniel died, I was in my garden pulling weeds. That is the part that stays with me. Not the phone call itself, not the way my knees buckled against the back porch steps, not even the sound of my own voice saying, "What do you mean he's gone?" over and over, like the repetition might change the answer. What stays with me is the garden, the weeds I was pulling, the absolute ordinary stupidity of what I was doing in the last moment before my life split in two. I had a small house in Larkspur, Texas. Not much to look at from the outside. A little brick place my late husband Harold had bought back in 1978, with a porch that leaned slightly to the left, and a garden that I kept going mostly out of habit and something close to stubbornness. The roses Harold planted were still there, leggy and unkempt, but alive. I like to think there was something to be said for that. I was 62 when Harold died. Daniel was 31 at the time, already living in California, already working in some kind of technology investments that I never fully understood. He came back for the funeral. He held my hand through the whole service and said, "I'm not going anywhere, Mom." And then, over the years that followed, he did. Not all at once. That's the thing about drift. It doesn't announce itself. It just happens, like water wearing down stone until one day you realize the stone is almost gone. We talked on the phone every Sunday for a while, then every other Sunday, then on birthdays and holidays, and then less. I told myself it was just life. People get busy. Sons grow into their own worlds. I told myself a lot of things in those years. His wife Vanessa was part of it. I knew that even then, though I didn't say it out loud to anyone, not even to my neighbor Ruth, who was the closest thing I had to a confidant. Vanessa had made it clear from the beginning, not with anything you could point to directly, nothing so obvious as an insult spoken plainly, but in the small, precise ways that a certain kind of woman knows how to make another woman feel invisible. She forgot to include my name on the Christmas cards. She answered my calls when Daniel wasn't home, and then somehow never remembered to pass along the messages. She sent back the jar of peach preserves I mailed with a short note saying Daniel didn't eat sugar anymore. It was never enough for a confrontation. That was the brilliance of it, if you could call it that. It was always just enough to sting. But Daniel? I thought Daniel still loved me, underneath all of it. I had to believe that. What else was I supposed to do? The call came at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning in October. I had my gardening gloves on and dirt under my fingernails, and my phone rang from inside the kitchen, and I thought about not answering it because I was right in the middle of something, and I think about that a lot now. How close I came to just letting it ring. The number was a California area code, but not Daniel's number. I remember staring at it on the screen for a moment. I picked up. The voice on the other end was careful and professional. A woman from Mercy General Hospital in San Jose, she said, asking if I was the mother of Daniel Marcus Harper. "Yes," I said. "That's my son." There was a pause that lasted less than a second, but felt much longer. "Mrs. Harper, I'm very sorry to tell you," and then the world tilted. They said it was his heart. 44 years old, no prior diagnosis, no warning. He had collapsed in a meeting at his office on a Monday afternoon, and by the time the paramedics arrived, there was nothing they could do. He was pronounced dead at 4:47 p.m. Pacific time. I was in the garden at 4:47 p.m. Pacific time. I was pulling weeds. I sat down on the back porch steps, and I didn't cry right away. That surprised me. I thought I would collapse, fall apart, come undone immediately. That's what you expect, isn't it, when something that enormous happens? But I just sat there with my gardening gloves still on and the phone against my chest, and I looked at Harold's roses, and I thought, in the most absurd and useless way, I need to call Daniel and tell him. That's when I started crying. Ruth came over within the hour. I must have called her. I don't remember doing it. She sat with me at the kitchen table and made tea that neither of us drank, and she held my hands and let me talk, which is the best thing you can do for someone in that situation. Not try to fix it, not offer explanations, just let them talk. I have to go out there, I said. Of course you do, Ruth said. Vanessa hasn't called me. Ruth went quiet for a moment. Well, maybe she doesn't know how to. She knew Daniel's mother's phone number, I said. She's known it for 20 years. Ruth didn't have an answer for that. I didn't expect one. I booked a flight the same afternoon, the earliest I could get, which had me connecting through Dallas and arriving in San Jose by 8 in the morning on Wednesday. The ticket cost more than I usually spent on groceries for 2 months. I didn't care. I put it on the card I used for emergencies, which I had been paying down slowly for 3 years, and I told myself I would figure it out later. I packed one small suitcase, church dress, because I thought I would be attending a funeral within the next few days. A few other things. My photograph of Daniel as a boy. I don't know why I packed that. It's not like I needed to bring it with me, but I put it in the outer pocket of the suitcase and I felt better with it there. On the plane, I sat in the middle seat between a young man with headphones and an older woman who fell asleep before we finished boarding. I held Daniel's photograph in my lap for most of the flight. He was maybe 8 years old in it, missing a front tooth, grinning at something outside the frame. Harold must have taken it. Daniel always looked at Harold like that, like his father was the funniest and most wonderful thing in the room. He looked like both of us. People always said so. Harold's jaw and my eyes. I thought, I'm going to bury my son. I thought, he was still my son, even at the end, even through all of it. I held the photograph, and I let myself believe that for the whole flight. Malmushat. The estate was in Hillborough. I looked it up on my phone in the taxi from the airport. I had never actually been to their home, which tells you something about the shape of those last several years. And when the address came up in the search, I just sat with the screen for a moment. A house on nearly 2 acres, 7 bedrooms, a pool in the back. Daniel had done well. I had known that in the abstract, the way you know something without really knowing it. He worked in venture capital, investments, technology. The details had always slid off me a little, I'll be honest, because I never fully understood the world he'd built. But looking at the photographs of that house on my phone screen while the taxi moved through California traffic, I felt something strange and heavy settle in my chest. He had built all of this and I had never been inside it. The taxi pulled up to an iron gate with a call box. I rolled down the window. Evelyn Harper, I said into the speaker. I'm Daniel's mother. There was a long pause. Long enough that I thought maybe the call box wasn't working. Then the gate opened. The driveway was long and curved through mature trees. The house at the end of it was exactly as large as the photograph suggested, maybe larger. There were already cars parked along the side, a few of them, expensive looking, belonging to people who had gotten there before me. A woman came out the front door as the taxi stopped. I paid the driver and got my suitcase out of the trunk, and by the time I turned around, she was standing at the top of the front steps. Vanessa. I had seen her, of course, at the wedding and a handful of times after that, but not for several years at this point. And she had changed in the way that wealthy women who work at it tend to change. Not older, exactly, but sharper. She was wearing a black silk dress that was clearly expensive. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was composed with a precision that I recognized as a kind of armor. She looked at me coming up the front walk with my small suitcase and my church dress and my old face full of grief, and something happened in her expression, a tightening, something that smoothed itself back out almost immediately into a neutral, careful blankness. Evelyn, she said, not you made it, or I'm glad you're here, or even I'm sorry, I should have called you, just my name, delivered like a fact. Vanessa. I stopped at the bottom of the steps. I came as fast as I could. I can see that, she said. Her eyes moved to my suitcase briefly. We have a lot to coordinate. There's a guest room in the East Wing. One of the housekeeping staff can show you. Not, come in, let me hold you, we both lost him. Not anything like that. Just the guest room in the East Wing. I climbed the front steps anyway.
What else was I going to do? He was my son. I had a right to be in that house no matter how she looked at me. She stepped back to let me through the door, but only just barely.
The inside of the house was the kind of beautiful that makes you feel slightly worse about yourself without being able to say exactly why. Everything was curated. The right kind of art on the walls, the right kind of furniture, nothing out of place, nothing personal except in a very deliberate and staged way. There was a large framed photograph of Daniel and Vanessa on one wall of the entryway, a professional portrait, both of them smiling the kind of smile you practice. Daniel looked handsome and distant and like someone I almost recognized. A woman in a uniform came and took my suitcase. I followed her up a staircase and down a long hall to a room that was pleasant and impersonal in the way of a good hotel. There was a window that looked out over the back garden. The bed had expensive linens. I sat on the edge of it for a few minutes after the woman left. I thought about calling Ruth. I thought about unpacking my suitcase. I thought about Daniel's photograph in the outer pocket. What I did instead was walk back downstairs. There were several people gathered in what I assumed was some kind of sitting room. Elegant chairs, a large fireplace with no fire in it, people speaking in low voices with wine glasses and small plates of food from a caterer's tray. I recognized no one, not a single face. My son had had this whole world, and I was a stranger in every inch of it. Vanessa was in the center of it. That was natural, I supposed. She was the widow. She was the one these people knew. She had one hand on the arm of a tall man in a dark suit, leaning slightly toward him, saying something I couldn't hear. She caught my eye across the room and something moved through her face again, that slight tightening, and then she turned back to the man. An older woman nearby noticed me standing in the doorway. "Are you?" she started. "I'm Daniel's mother," I said. She blinked. "Oh," she said. "Oh, I didn't know he—" And then she stopped herself, which told me everything about what she'd been told. Before I could say anything else, Vanessa materialized at my side. The speed of it was impressive. "Evelyn," she said, her voice warm now in a way that was precisely calibrated for the room. "Let me introduce you to some of Daniel's colleagues." She put a hand lightly on my arm and steered me slightly to the side, away from the woman who'd been speaking to me. "I should mention, these are all business associates, very important relationships for the estate going forward. So if you could just—" She lowered her voice to something gentler, more pointed. "Just let me handle things. You understand?" I looked at her hand on my arm. I looked at her face. "Handle things," I said. "The funeral arrangements are all being managed by a firm Daniel and I worked with. There's a preferred vendor relationship. Everything's already in place. You don't need to worry about any of it." "I wasn't aware you'd already made arrangements," I said, without telling me. "I'm his wife, Evelyn." The warmth stayed in her voice, but something under it went flat and cold. "That is, I was his wife. These decisions fall to me. He was my son for 44 years before he was your husband." She smiled. It didn't reach anything. "Of course he was," she said. "And I'm sure that was very meaningful to both of you." She moved away. Back toward the center of the room, back toward the people who knew her, who thought of her as Daniel's wife and didn't know enough to think of me as anything at all. I stood there in the doorway of my dead son's sitting room, surrounded by strangers, and I made myself a quiet and private decision. I was not leaving. Not until I had done what I came here to do. Not until I had stood at his grave and said what needed to be said and given him the goodbye he deserved. Whatever Vanessa had decided about who I was to my son, that was her story. It wasn't mine. I went back upstairs and got Daniel's photograph out of the suitcase pocket and set it on the nightstand next to the bed. 8 years old, missing his front tooth, grinning at something I couldn't see. "I'm here, baby," I said to the photograph, which I know sounds foolish, but I didn't care. "Your mama's here." I sat on the edge of that expensive bed in that impersonal room in the house where my son had lived without me, and I let myself grieve, really grieve, not the managed, careful kind I'd been doing on the plane and in the taxi and all the way through that house, but the ugly, ragged, gut-deep kind that has no dignity in it whatsoever and doesn't ask permission. I cried until I was empty, and then I washed my face and went back downstairs. Because Daniel Harper was my son, and no woman with a silk dress and a cold smile was going to make me forget it. I did not sleep well that first night. The guest room was comfortable in every measurable way. The mattress was the kind that costs more than most people's monthly rent. The linens were soft. The room was quiet in the way that only very expensive houses in very wealthy neighborhoods managed to be quiet, as if even the sound of the world outside had been purchased and removed. But I lay there in the dark for most of the night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me, thinking about Daniel. Not the Daniel I had watched die in my imagination on that long flight out here. The other one. The earlier one. The boy who used to fall asleep on the couch with his head in my lap watching television on Friday nights. The one who cried when our old dog Biscuit died and tried very hard to pretend he hadn't. The one who called me from his first apartment in Austin at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night just to tell me he'd figured out how to make my pot roast, and it had come out right, and he was so proud of himself he couldn't wait until morning to say so. That Daniel, the one I raised, I kept trying to connect that boy to the house I was lying in, to the framed professional photographs and the catered trays and the iron gate and the long curved driveway. I kept trying to find him in all of it and coming up short. Sometime around 4 in the morning, I gave up on sleeping and went to the window and stood there looking out at the back garden, which was illuminated by low landscape lighting. The kind of thing you hire a designer to plan, not the kind of thing that just happens. It was beautiful, I'll give it that. Manicured and deliberate and beautiful. Daniel had grown up with a backyard that had a rusted swing set and a vegetable garden that flooded every spring. He used to help me pull the tomato cages out of the mud after heavy rains, both of us in our boots, both of us laughing at the mess of it. I wondered if he ever thought about that. I wondered if Vanessa even knew that story existed. By 6 in the morning, I was dressed and downstairs. The house had staff that arrived early. I heard them in the kitchen, quiet and efficient, and I felt strange about that too, about the idea of people being paid to be invisible in your own home. I found a coffee maker and figured it out after a moment, and stood at the kitchen island with my mug and the early light coming in through the windows, and I thought, this is where my son had his coffee every morning. I put my hands flat on the cold stone counter, and I tried to feel something of him there, which is a foolish thing, and I knew it even then. But grief makes you reach for foolish things. A young woman appeared in the kitchen doorway, one of the household staff, I guessed, maybe mid-20s, with her hair pulled back and an uncertain look on her face when she saw me. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know anyone was up. Do you need anything?" "No," I said. "I just needed coffee." "I hope that's all right." "Of course." She came in and began going about her business quietly, and I watched her move around that kitchen with the ease of someone who knew where everything was, who had been doing this a long time, and I realized this woman had spent more mornings in my son's home than I ever had. "What's your name?" I asked. She looked up. "Lily." "How long did you work for Daniel?" Something changed in her face when I said his name, a softening, quick and involuntary. 4 years, she said. "Almost 5. Did you know him well?" She was quiet for a moment, weighing something. "He was kind," she said finally. "He remembered things about people. He asked about my mother when she was sick." She paused. "He was a good man." I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug. "Yes," I said, "he was." We didn't say anything else after that, but I felt better for the conversation. It was the first true thing anyone in that house had said to me since I arrived. Vanessa came downstairs at 9. She was dressed, put together, composed. Not the face of a woman who had been lying awake grieving, but I tried not to judge that, because people process loss differently, and some people armor up rather than fall apart, and I had no way of knowing what she looked like at 4 in the morning when no one was watching. She saw me at the kitchen island and paused for just a fraction of a second. "You're up early," she said. "I always have been," I said. "Daniel got it from me." She crossed to the coffee maker without responding to that and poured herself a cup and stood on the opposite side of the island from me. The distance felt very deliberate. "There's a meeting with the funeral home at 11, she said. "I'll be handling that. I'd like to come." She looked at me over the rim of her cup. "That's really not necessary, Evelyn. It's already been arranged. He was my son, and these are decisions that fall to his next of kin." "I am his next of kin," I said. I'm his mother. She set her cup down. The sound of it on the stone was very precise, very controlled. As the spouse, she said, I have legal authority over... I'm not trying to take authority from you, I said, and I worked hard to keep my voice even. I'm asking to come and be present while you make decisions about how to bury my child. I'm asking for that one thing. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not softness, calculation. She was figuring out how to handle me in a way that cost her the least. Fine, she said. You can come. But please understand, these arrangements are already largely finalized, so it's really more of a formality at this point. She walked out of the kitchen with her coffee. I stayed where I was for a moment, staring at the counter. Already largely finalized. Daniel had been dead for less than 48 hours. She had made decisions about his funeral before calling his mother. I set my mug in the sink and went upstairs to get my purse. Well, the funeral home was the most expensive kind, which is to say it looked like a very tasteful living room that happened to smell of lilies. The director was a man named Whitmore, who wore a dark suit and spoke in the measured tones of someone professionally trained in managing people's worst days. He treated Vanessa with the particular deference that comes from recognizing a client who is spending a significant amount of money. He barely looked at me. The decisions, as Vanessa had said, were already largely finalized. The casket had been chosen. The flowers had been ordered. The service date was set for Saturday. The cemetery plot had been arranged, not in Texas, not near Harold, not anywhere I could visit without a plane ticket, but in a private cemetery in the hills outside San Jose, where Whitmore informed us with a small, reverent tilt of his head, several notable regional figures were also interred. Daniel grew up in Texas, I said at one point. He was buried, his father is buried in Texas. Whitmore looked at Vanessa. Vanessa looked at me with that smile that wasn't one. Daniel lived here for 15 years, Evelyn. California was his home. His family is in Texas. His life was here. His mother, Vanessa said, and her voice went a degree cooler, is welcome to attend the service on Saturday. That was the whole point of you coming out here, wasn't it? To attend the service? She said it quietly enough that only I could hear it. Whitmore had developed a sudden interest in the folder of documents on the table in front of him. I sat back in my chair. My hands were in my lap, and I pressed them together under the table where no one could see. She was right that there was nothing I could legally do. She was his wife. The decisions were hers. And maybe, this is the part I turned over in my mind for the rest of that day, maybe Daniel had wanted it that way. Maybe he had wanted to be buried in California near the life he had built. I didn't know. I hadn't been close enough to know. That was the thing that kept hitting me over and over in waves I couldn't quite prepare for, the things I didn't know about my own son. I signed nothing at the funeral home. I said very little after that. I sat in the car on the way back to the estate and watched California roll past the window, and I thought about Harold's grave in Larkspur, which I visited every Sunday and which had a small Texas sage planted near the marker because it grew without much water, and I couldn't always get out there in the summer to tend it. Daniel would be 3 states away from his father. Neither of them had asked me about it, and one of them wasn't here to ask anymore. The afternoon brought more people to the estate, a rotation of Vanessa's friends, business associates, people who had known Daniel in the world he'd inhabited. They moved through the main rooms of the house, bringing wine and flowers and expensive food and the particular social performance of grief that certain kinds of people are very practiced at. There was a lot of talking about legacy and impact. There was a lot of he was so brilliant and he changed the industry, and very little of anything that sounded like a man I recognized. I sat in a chair near the window in the sitting room for most of the afternoon. A few people came over to introduce themselves. They were invariably surprised to learn I was Daniel's mother. One man actually said, "I didn't know Daniel had family," which he immediately tried to walk back, and I let him, because what else was there to do? Vanessa held court in the center of the room. She was good at it, I'll say that. She knew how to receive grief, how to accept condolences with the right amount of composure and the right amount of visible sadness and the right kind of gratitude that made people feel their presence was meaningful. She told a story about Daniel proposing to her on a trip to Italy that made people laugh softly and press their hands to their hearts. She did not tell any stories about where he came from. At one point, a woman sat down beside me, mid-40s, kind face, and she said her name was Patricia and that she had worked with Daniel for about 6 years. "He talked about you," she said. I looked at her. "He did?" "Not often," she said, and she seemed to understand immediately that the qualifier landed wrong because she added quickly, "But when he did, you could tell it meant something. He mentioned you'd made this peach preserve that he thought about every summer and could never quite replicate. He actually tried, once, brought in some that he'd made himself." She smiled. "It wasn't very good." I laughed. It surprised me. It came up before I could stop it, and it was a real laugh, the kind that has a little bit of crying in it. "The secret's in the lemon," I said. I told him that. He never believed the lemon made a difference. "He said almost exactly that," Patricia said, "that you always insisted on the lemon." We sat together for a few minutes and talked about Daniel, the real Daniel, not the one being described in the room around us. She told me about how he made a point of learning the names of everyone in the office, down to the building maintenance staff. How he drove himself to work despite being able to afford a car service because he didn't like the idea of someone else sitting around waiting on him. Small things. The kind of things that tell you who a person actually is. I was grateful for every single one of them. From across the room, I felt Vanessa notice the conversation. I didn't look at her directly, but I felt it. The way you feel someone's attention without seeing it, a kind of pressure shift. Patricia left a few minutes later, pressing my hand warmly as she went. Vanessa appeared at my side within 90 seconds. "Making friends?" she said. "Patricia worked with Daniel for 6 years," I said. "Patricia is a mid-level analyst who Daniel was actually in the process of transitioning out before he died," Vanessa said, with a smile that was clearly meant to diminish everything the woman had just given me. "Just so you know the context." I looked at her. "Why would you say something like that to me right now?" She blinked as if the question was unreasonable. "I'm just giving you accurate information." "No," I said quietly. "You're trying to take something away from me. That's what you're doing." She stared at me for a moment, and I saw something cross her face that I hadn't seen there before. Not anger exactly, but something closer to it. Like I had surprised her by naming it. "I think you're overtired," she said. "It's been a hard few days. Why don't you go rest before dinner?" She walked away. I stayed in the chair and pressed my hands flat on my thighs and breathed through the urge to say something that would have burned the room down. I didn't, though. Not then. Dinner that evening was catered, set out on the long dining room table that I estimated could seat 14 people comfortably. There were maybe 8 of us. Vanessa, a few of her close friends, a man I gathered was some kind of financial advisor, a couple who had known Daniel and Vanessa socially. I was placed at the far end of the table from Vanessa, which I'm certain was not accidental. The conversation moved around me like water around a rock. I ate and listened and said very little. At some point, the financial advisor, a man named Gregory, who had the easy confidence of someone used to being the most important person in any room, said something about the estate that caught my attention. "The portfolio alone," he was saying to the man beside him, though not quietly enough, "is structured in a way that's going to require some significant work to untangle." Daniel was meticulous, but meticulous in a way that only Daniel understood. The trust structures especially. "Gregory," Vanessa said from the other end of the table. Her voice was pleasant. He looked up. "This isn't the moment," she said. "Of course," he said. "You're right. Absolutely." He took a sip of wine. "My apologies." But the word had landed with me. Trust structures. Daniel had trust structures, which meant he had arranged things deliberately, with intention, not just a simple account that would pass automatically to a spouse. I thought about that for the rest of the meal. After dinner, I excused myself early and went up to the room. I called Ruth. "How is it?" she asked. "Strange," I said. "Hard. Vanessa is—" I stopped, trying to find the word that was accurate without being uncharitable. I gave up trying. "She's difficult, Ruth. She's managing everything. She made all the funeral decisions without me. She put me at the end of the table tonight like I was a guest she felt obligated to feed. Ruth was quiet for a moment. And how are you holding up? I don't know, I said honestly. I keep thinking I'm fine and then something happens and I'm not. Did you at least get to... She paused. Are they letting you be near him before the service? There's a viewing Friday evening, I said. Before the funeral on Saturday. Good, Ruth said. That's what matters. That's why you went. She was right. I knew she was right. That was why I had gotten on a plane and spent money I didn't entirely have and put myself inside this house with this woman who looked through me like glass. Not for the war of it. Not to fight over anything, just to say goodbye to my son. I could get through 2 more days. I put Daniel's photograph back on the nightstand and lay down on top of the covers without changing because I was too tired to do it properly, and the room was warm enough. Thursday was worse. Vanessa had arranged some kind of gathering. She called it a celebration of life reception, which is a phrase I've always found somewhat absurd, but I understand the impulse behind it. And the house filled up again by mid-morning. More business people, more of Daniel's world. A photographer moved through the rooms discreetly, which I didn't understand at first. And then I realized Vanessa had hired someone to document the event. She was building something. I didn't fully understand what yet, but she was curating this whole week the way you curate a narrative. Photographs and guest lists and managed moments, the story of Daniel Harper's death as she wanted it told. I found Daniel's home office late in the morning. It was at the end of a hall on the 2nd floor, and the door was partially open, and something pulled me toward it. It was the most real room I had seen in that house. His desk was heavy walnut, covered in papers that had clearly been moved and stacked by someone. Vanessa's people, I guessed, or the estate attorneys. But the disorder underneath was still visible, the ghost of how he actually worked. There were sticky notes on the edge of the monitor, a ceramic mug with a dried ring of old coffee in the bottom, photographs pinned to a corkboard on the wall. I went to the corkboard. There were pictures of Daniel with business colleagues, with Vanessa at events, at what looked like charity dinners. But there were other things pinned there too. A hand-drawn card. And when I looked closer, I realized it was in crayon, the kind of card a young child makes, with a lopsided house and a yellow sun. And at the bottom, in wavering child's handwriting, "Thank you for the books, Uncle Daniel." A newspaper clipping about a youth literacy program with Daniel's name mentioned as a donor. A small piece of notepaper that I almost didn't look at closely enough. I leaned in. It was my handwriting. I didn't recognize it immediately. It was from years ago, the letters rounder and more careful than how I write now. But it was mine. I knew it after a moment. It was a note I had tucked into a birthday card. I didn't remember the exact words, but I remembered the birthday, his 40th. I had sent him a card because I didn't know what else to give a man who had everything, and I had written something about how proud I was of him, and how much I loved him, and how I hoped he knew that no matter the distance. He had pinned it to the wall above his desk. He had looked at it every day. I put my hand over my mouth and stood there in my dead son's office, and I let that settle into me like water into dry ground. All that time. All those years of wondering if he had drifted too far. All those Sundays when I called and the phone rang a few extra times before he picked up. And all those holidays when Vanessa's influence was so present, I could feel it pressing him away from me. I had told myself so many stories about what those things meant. I had wondered, in the dark and private way that you wonder about things you're afraid to say out loud, whether he still thought about me the way I thought about him. The note was on his corkboard. It was above his desk. He had put it there on purpose and left it there every day. "What are you doing in here?" I turned. Vanessa was in the doorway. Her voice was carefully controlled, but something underneath it was not. "The door was open," I said. "This room is off limits right now," she said. "The estate attorneys have advised that nothing be disturbed until the legal process." "I wasn't disturbing anything," I said. "I was looking at his corkboard." Her eyes moved to the corkboard and back to me. Quick, precise. "I need you to leave this room," she said. "Vanessa, now, please." I walked toward the door. I stopped when I was even with her in the doorway, close enough that I could have reached out and touched her arm if I'd wanted to. "He kept my note," I said. "He had it pinned up where he could see it." She said nothing. I just wanted you to know that I saw it, I said. That I know he kept it. I walked past her and down the hall. I heard the office door close behind me.
Friday was the viewing. I had been in the same room as my son's casket for exactly 37 years. Harold's funeral, Daniel at 14. Both of us wrecked in different ways, and neither of us quite knowing how to help the other through it. I had thought about that a lot over the years. Whether I had done enough for Daniel after Harold died. Whether I had been so consumed by my own grief that I had left him too much alone with his. This was different. This was the other direction. The direction no parent is supposed to go. The viewing was held in a reception hall at the funeral home. Whitmore and his people had arranged everything. Flowers, lighting, the casket open at the front of the room. Daniel looked like himself and not like himself, the way people always look at these things, the animation gone and only the shape of him left. I sat beside the casket for a long time. People moved past, spoke their words, moved on. I stayed. At some point, when the room had thinned out a little, I heard Vanessa nearby, talking to a pair of women I didn't know. I wasn't trying to listen, but they were close, and the room had gotten quieter. "She just appeared," Vanessa was saying, and I understood immediately that she was talking about me. "No warning, no—" "That must be difficult," one of the women said. "Difficult doesn't cover it. Daniel and his mother had barely spoken in years, genuinely barely spoken. He felt obligated, you understand. Family guilt is a powerful thing, but she was never—" She paused, choosing her word. "She was never a significant presence in his life. Not in the life he actually lived. She's from this little town in Texas. She never understood what he was trying to build. And honestly, he had made peace with—" I stood up. I did it slowly. I didn't want to make a scene at my son's viewing. I had promised myself I would not make a scene at my son's viewing. I walked directly past Vanessa and her companions without looking at any of them, went through the side door into the hallway, and stood against the wall and breathed. She was never a significant presence in his life. The note on the corkboard, 4 years of Sunday calls, the pot roast he'd stayed up trying to get right, the birthday card he had pinned above his desk. I stood in that hallway and I thought, she knows none of it. She has built an entire story about who I was to my son, and she built it out of nothing, out of air, out of whatever she needed to believe in order to justify the years she spent pressing me out. Or she knew it, and was saying it anyway. I wasn't sure which was worse. When I went back into the viewing room, I went straight back to the casket. I didn't look at Vanessa. I sat back down beside my son, and I put my hand on the casket edge, and I kept it there. I had outlasted 20 years of slow erasure. I could last one more night. Saturday was the funeral, and I was going to be there, in the front row if I had to fight for the seat, because Daniel Harper was my son, and had always been my son, and the woman in the silk dress had never managed to change that, no matter how many years she'd had to try. Saturday came in gray and cold, which surprised me about California, until I remembered that October out here could go either way, and that the weather had never cared much about what humans needed from it on any particular day. I was dressed by 6:30, church dress again, the good black one I'd brought, with the small pearl earrings Harold had given me for our 25th anniversary. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while with Daniel's photograph in my hands, and I talked to him quietly, the way you do when someone is gone, and the talking is really just for you. I told him I was sorry it took me so long to understand the distance between us. I told him I should have fought harder, earlier, before the years stacked up and the habit of silence set in. I told him I was proud of the man he'd been, even the parts of that man I'd never gotten to see. I told him I was going to be there today, front row if I had to. I meant that last part. Downstairs, the house was already in motion. Vanessa's people. And I had started thinking of everyone in that house in those terms, her people, because that's what they were moving through the rooms making last-minute arrangements, coordinating with drivers, managing the flower deliveries that were still arriving. Vanessa herself emerged from the master suite at 7:30 in a black dress that had clearly been chosen with the same care she applied to everything else. Structured, expensive, perfectly fitted.
The dress of a woman who understood that grief had an audience and intended to perform well for it. She saw me at the bottom of the stairs and stopped. "There are cars leaving for the church at 9, she said. "You can ride with Gregory and his wife." Not with her. Not in the family car. With the financial advisor and his wife tucked in with the business associates where I could be managed at a distance. "I'll find my own way," I said. She paused. "It's not practical for you to—" I said I'll find my own way, Vanessa. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't entirely read, something between irritation and a kind of reluctant assessment, like she was recalibrating something. Then she moved on without another word. I called a taxi. I arrived at the church, a large, modern, non-denominational facility in the hills that held about 300 people, 15 minutes before the service began. The place was already filling. I had not expected so many people, and then I caught myself, because of course there were many people. Daniel had built something real. He had mattered to a lot of lives in ways I was still only beginning to understand. The front pew on the left side had a small reserved placard. I sat down in it before anyone could tell me I couldn't. A young man in a dark usher's suit appeared at my shoulder within seconds. "Ma'am, this section is reserved for—" "I'm Evelyn Harper," I said. "Daniel's mother." He blinked, glanced toward the back of the church where I assumed Vanessa was organizing her entrance, made a decision. "Of course," he said. "I'm sorry for your loss." He left me there. Vanessa processed in with a small group, 2 women friends flanking her, Gregory and his wife just behind. She came up the center aisle with the measured pace of someone who understood the theater of a moment like this. And when she reached the front pew on the right side and looked across and saw me sitting on the left, I watched her face do something complicated. She didn't say anything. She sat down. Her friend leaned in and whispered something to her. She shook her head slightly. The service began. I'm not going to describe all of it, because some of it was private in the way that grief is private, and I have been carrying the weight of that hour for long enough that I don't need to lay out every piece of it here. What I will say is this. There were 6 eulogies, and not one of them was given by anyone from Daniel's family. Not one of them mentioned Texas. Not one of them mentioned his father, Harold, or the town he grew up in, or the woman who raised him alone after Harold died and worked 2 jobs to do it. They spoke about his mind, his vision, his capacity for strategic thinking, his philanthropic commitments. He sounded brilliant and generous and impressive and almost completely unrecognizable to me. The last eulogist was Vanessa herself. She stood at the podium and spoke for about 10 minutes. She talked about the day they met at a conference in San Francisco. She talked about their trips, their home, the life they had built together. She cried at one point, a single, carefully timed tear that she pressed away with one finger, and the room responded with the collective exhale of people who are moved, and I sat in the front pew and I kept my hands folded in my lap, and I looked at Daniel's casket at the front of the room, and I thought about the note on the corkboard. He had kept it above his desk. When she finished and returned to her seat, she glanced across the aisle at me. Just once, quick. I don't know what she was looking for on my face. Whatever it was, I don't think she found it. At the graveside, I stood slightly apart from the main group. The cemetery was exactly as Whitmore had described it. Beautiful, manicured, the kind of place that costs more per plot than most people's first cars. The hills around us were brown and golden in the October light, and the sky had cleared slightly to a pale, watery blue. There were maybe 60 people gathered. The casket was lowered while a cellist played something I didn't recognize. I did not cry at the graveside. I had done my crying in that guest room, and in that hallway, and in the taxi on the way to the church. I stood there and I watched them put my son into the California earth, 3 states from his father, and I said my last private words to him inside my head where no one could hear or curate or manage them. Goodbye, baby. I love you. I always did, even when I wasn't brave enough to fight harder for it. I felt a hand on my arm. I turned. Patricia, the woman from the office, the one who'd told me about the peach preserves, was standing beside me. She looked like she'd been crying. Are you all right? She asked, which was a question with no real answer. Not really, I said. But I will be. She nodded. He would have wanted you here, she said. I want you to know that. Whatever else happened this week, he would have wanted his mother here. I squeezed her hand and didn't try to speak, Schatz. The reception afterward was back at the estate. I did not want to go. Every part of me wanted to call the taxi company and go directly to the airport and get on the first flight back to Texas and never see that house again. But there was something I had to stay for, something that had been mentioned in the background noise of this week and that I was only now understanding I needed to pay attention to. The will reading was scheduled for Monday morning. I hadn't known about it until Friday evening, when I overheard Gregory on the phone in the hallway saying something about an estate attorney named Calloway and a meeting at 10 on Monday and the importance of having the correct parties present. I hadn't been told by Vanessa. No one had told me. I had overheard it by accident while walking past a half-open door. That alone told me something. I went back to the estate after the funeral, and I sat through 2 more hours of the reception, the catered food and the soft music and the business conversations that resumed a little too quickly, the way they always do. And when the rooms finally thinned out toward early evening, I went and found Gregory before he left. He was in the front hallway getting his coat. "Gregory," I said, "I understand there's a will reading Monday morning." He went very still in the way that people go still when they've been caught knowing something they assumed you didn't know. "That's—" "Yes," he said, "with the estate attorney Calloway. It's a private proceeding." "I'm Daniel's mother," I said. "Am I considered a party to the estate?" He glanced toward the sitting room, where Vanessa was still speaking with a few remaining guests. A quick involuntary glance that told me everything I needed. "That's really a question for Mr. Calloway," he said. "Then I'd like his contact information," I said. Another glance. "I don't think I'm the right person to—" "Gregory." I kept my voice pleasant. I had learned that in 30 years of navigating difficult situations, pleasant is more powerful than hard. "I'm not asking you to do anything improper. I'm asking for the name and number of the estate attorney handling my son's affairs, so that I can determine whether I have a legal right to be present at Monday's proceedings. That's a reasonable request." He looked at me for a long moment, recalibrating, the same way Vanessa had done that morning, the same way people kept doing when they expected something softer and got something else. He took out his wallet and produced a business card. Not Calloway's, his own. He turned it over and wrote a number on the back. "That's Calloway's office," he said quietly. "Thank you," I said. He left without saying goodbye to Vanessa, which may have meant nothing or may have meant something. I went upstairs and called the number from the guest room. It went to voicemail. Of course, it was a Saturday evening, and I left a message identifying myself as Daniel Marcus Harper's biological mother and stating that I would like to understand my standing regarding the Monday morning will reading. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and waited. Calloway's office called me back Sunday morning at 8:15. The person on the phone was not Calloway himself, but a paralegal named Sandra, who was apologetically professional in the way of people delivering carefully chosen information. "Mrs. Harper," she said, "I've reviewed the file and I can confirm that you are named in the documentation. You're entitled to be present Monday morning." I held the phone and let that settle. "I'm named in the documentation," I repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "Can you tell me in what capacity?" A small pause. "Mr. Calloway would prefer to discuss the specifics in person, but I can confirm you have standing to attend." I thanked her and hung up and sat very still in the middle of that expensive bed in that impersonal room, and I thought about what that might mean. I told myself not to build anything around it. Daniel could have named me in any number of ways, as a party to be notified, as someone with a minor bequest, as anything. I told myself not to hope for something specific, because hope in that direction felt dangerous and presumptuous, like I was expecting something from my son instead of just loving him. But I could not quite stop myself from thinking about that corkboard, about the note, about the way Patricia had described him, the small deliberate kindnesses, the memory for detail, the care he took with people who might not have expected to matter to him. I went downstairs and ate breakfast alone in the kitchen and did not tell Vanessa about the call. Sunday was its own particular kind of tension. Vanessa spent most of it in the master suite with the door closed, which suited me. I walked the back garden in the morning, really walked it, properly, for the first time since I arrived. It was well designed, I could admit that. But it was also sterile in a way that gardens shouldn't be. Everything contained and controlled, nothing growing outside its designated space. No volunteers, no sprawl, nothing that had decided on its own to be somewhere. Harold's garden had been the opposite. Things growing everywhere they weren't supposed to, and Harold's attitude being that if a plant was determined enough to grow somewhere, it had earned the right to stay. I thought Daniel had probably been more like Harold than anyone in this house understood. Late Sunday afternoon, Vanessa appeared in the sitting room where I was reading. I had found a book on one of the shelves, some thriller that I couldn't concentrate on, but that gave my hand something to do. She stood in the doorway with a glass of wine and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Not hostile, not calculating, just tired. "You're staying through Monday," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." She nodded slowly, like she was processing something she'd suspected. "The will reading is at 10, she said. "Calloway's office is in Palo Alto. I can have someone drive you." I looked up from the book. "You know I was notified." "Calloway's office called me after they called you," she said. "Standard procedure." She took a sip of wine. "I assume Gregory gave you the number." "He did." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, the light was going gold and long the way it does on autumn evenings, and for just a second the room felt almost like a real place, like somewhere two people might sit and have an honest conversation. Almost. "I want you to understand something," she said, and her voice was different now, lower, more direct, without the social performance I'd been watching all week. "Whatever is in that will, whatever Daniel decided, I intend to protect what we built together. He and I built something, 15 years. "I know that," I said. "Then you understand that I'm not going to simply stand back if the terms are—" She stopped. Chose a different word. "Unexpected." "I understand that you'll do what you believe you have to do," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the master suite, and I watched her go, and I thought, she's afraid. Underneath all of it, the silk dresses and the precision and the performance, she's genuinely afraid of what that room is going to say tomorrow morning, which meant she already had some idea. Monday morning arrived with clear skies for the first time all week. I was in the car at 9, driven by one of the household staff, sitting in the back with my purse in my lap and Daniel's old photograph in my coat pocket, because I had put it there without thinking and only noticed it as we were pulling out of the driveway. The law office of Thomas Calloway was on a high floor of a glass building in Palo Alto, the kind of office that exists to communicate, without saying anything directly, that the people who work here handle money that most people do not have access to. The waiting area had leather chairs and original art, and a receptionist who spoke in a measured, deferential voice and offered me coffee in a real cup. Vanessa arrived 7 minutes after I did. She had brought an attorney of her own, a man she introduced to no one, who simply appeared at her side and sat beside her in the conference room. Tall, silver-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who spent a lot of time in rooms like this and had learned that stillness communicated competence. Gregory was there. 2 other people I didn't know. I later learned one was a representative from Daniel's primary business entity, and one was an accountant. And me. In a chair that someone had placed, I noticed, directly across the table from Vanessa. Thomas Calloway was in his late 60s, compact and precise, with wire-rimmed glasses and the unhurried manner of a man who had been delivering consequential information to people for decades and understood that rushing it helped no one. He offered brief condolences to the room and then opened the folder in front of him without preamble. He explained the basics first, the structure of Daniel's estate, which was more complex than I had understood. There were business interests, investment portfolios, real estate holdings including the Hillborough estate, and 2 other properties, liquid assets, and a charitable trust that Daniel had established separately, and which was, Calloway explained, already operational and not subject to the current proceeding. The total value of the distributable estate, before taxes and fees and the resolution of certain obligations, was approximately $31 million. I heard Vanessa inhale slowly beside her attorney. "In accordance with Daniel Harper's last will and testament," Calloway said, settling his glasses slightly. Executed 14 months ago and witnessed by two independent parties. The estate is to be distributed as follows. He read for several minutes. There were provisions for charitable contributions, a bequest to a youth literacy nonprofit, provisions for certain employees of Daniel's company, a trust for a niece and nephew I hadn't known about, children of a cousin of Daniel's on Harold's side, people I had lost track of years ago. Vanessa's attorney had his pen out. He was writing quickly. Then Calloway paused and looked up briefly before continuing. The Hillborough residential property and its associated furnishings are bequeathed to Vanessa Claire Harper, along with a cash settlement of $2 million and the maintenance of her health insurance coverage for a period of 5 years. $2 million. In any other context, an enormous sum. In this room, against $31 million, it landed like a stone dropped into a very deep well. I heard Vanessa make a sound, not quite a word, something that started as one and didn't finish. The remaining assets, Calloway continued, and his voice was entirely even, including all investment portfolios, business interests, commercial real estate holdings, and liquid assets, are bequeathed in their entirety to Evelyn May Harper, mother of the deceased. The room did not move. I mean that literally. For what felt like a long time, no one in that room moved or spoke or seemed to breathe. The air had gone strange and solid, the way it does in the seconds after something very loud, when the sound is gone but the body hasn't caught up yet. I sat with my hands in my lap, and I looked at Thomas Calloway's face, and I thought, I misheard. That was my first thought, that I had misheard something or misunderstood, or that there was another Evelyn May Harper somewhere and the room was about to figure out the mistake. Calloway looked directly at me. Mrs. Harper, he said, Daniel left specific instructions that a letter be read aloud to all parties at this point, if you are willing. My voice came out smaller than I intended. Yes, I said, please. He removed a sealed envelope from the folder. He had clearly already read it. There was something in his expression, not quite emotion, but its neighbor, and he unfolded the pages inside it. Mom, he read, and that one word, my son's handwriting in Calloway's voice, hit me somewhere below the ribs in a place I don't have a name for. If you're hearing this, then I did what I'd been putting off doing for longer than I should have, which is tell you the truth about some things. I'm not going to be able to say all of it the way I want to, so I'll say what I can. I know the years got away from us. I know there were stretches where the calls got shorter and the visits stopped, and you must have felt it happening the way you feel a slow leak. You know something's wrong, but you can't quite find where it's coming from. I want you to know that I felt it too. I felt it every single year, and I didn't know how to fix it, and I kept thinking I'd figure it out next year, and here we are. I had your note on my corkboard above my desk, the one from my 40th birthday. I read it more than I ever told you. There were mornings when it was the first thing I saw, and it reminded me that someone had loved me before all of this, before the money and the title and the version of me that other people decided to invest in. You loved me when I was just a boy with a missing tooth, who cried about a dog and couldn't make pot roast right. That is not a small thing. I don't think I understood how not small it was until recently. I'm leaving you what I built because I want you to be safe for the rest of your life. I want you to not worry about the cost of a plane ticket or a medical bill or whether the roses need replacing. I want you to have the room to breathe that you spent your whole life giving to everyone else instead of yourself. This isn't about punishment or message sending or any of the drama that will probably follow this reading. It's just what I want. It's what I've wanted for a while, and I kept not doing it, and I'm doing it now. Take care of yourself. Buy new roses if the old ones finally give out. Know that I knew, even at the end, even through all of it, I knew exactly where I came from, and I was proud of it. Love, Daniel. Calloway folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope and slid it across the table toward me. I put my hand on it. The room came back slowly, sounds returning, the sense of other people breathing, the awareness of being in a body in a chair. I became aware that my face was wet, and I didn't remember starting to cry. From across the table, I heard Vanessa's attorney say something to her in a low voice, very quick, and I heard her say back, not quietly, not really, whether she intended it that way or not. That's not possible. That is not possible. I looked up. Vanessa was staring at Calloway with an expression I had not seen on her face all week. Not the controlled performance of grief, not the careful management, not the social precision. Something raw and disarranged, something that looked almost like the face of a person seeing solid ground crack open beneath them. He was not of sound mind, she said. When this was written, he was under enormous stress. We were going through a difficult period, and I have grounds to contest. Mrs. Harper, Calloway said, with a patient firmness that suggested this was not the first time he had heard something like this across a table. The will was executed 14 months ago, witnessed by two independent parties with no stake in the estate, and accompanied by a capacity evaluation from Daniel's physician at the time, specifically because Daniel anticipated the possibility of a challenge. He was quite deliberate in his preparation. Vanessa's attorney put a hand on her arm. She shook it off. She influenced him, she said, and now she looked directly at me, and the mask was gone entirely, all of it, and what was underneath it was ugly and unfiltered, and maybe the most honest she had been all week. You got to him somehow. You convinced him to. He barely spoke to you. He was done with that part of his life. You had nothing to do with who he became. Vanessa, her attorney's voice was sharp. She is a 72-year-old woman from a small town in Texas who never understood one single thing about what Daniel built. Enough. The attorney stood up. He put his hand on her shoulder, firm this time. Stop talking. The room was very quiet. I had not moved. I had not said a word. I sat with my hand on Daniel's letter, and I looked at Vanessa. Really looked at her, maybe for the first time since I'd arrived. And what I saw was not a villain, exactly. What I saw was a woman who had organized her entire sense of herself around a story, and the story had just been rewritten by a dead man. And she didn't know yet how to exist outside of it. I understood grief doing strange things to people. I had no room in me to feel victorious about any of this. What I felt, if I'm honest, was a grief that went deeper than the inheritance, deeper than the will, deeper than the whole surreal theater of that room. I felt the grief of a son who had felt it necessary to communicate his love through an estate attorney and a sealed letter rather than a phone call. I felt the grief of years spent on the wrong side of a distance that neither of us had known how to close. The money was not the gift. The letter was the gift. The money was just the proof that he meant it. Calloway was speaking again. Procedural matters, next steps, the formal language of estate law. And Vanessa's attorney was writing things down, and Vanessa herself had gone very still and very white in her chair, staring at something on the table in front of her that wasn't really there. Gregory caught my eye from across the room. His expression was not what I expected. It wasn't quite surprise. It was something that looked like relief, though I couldn't have said why. I picked up the envelope with Daniel's letter in it and put it in my purse. Outside the windows, the California sky was entirely blue now. The gray of the week burned off, and the sunlight came in across the table and lit up the dust motes floating in the air above all our heads. And I thought about Daniel as a boy in our backyard in Larkspur, standing in the mud after a rainstorm with his boots on, laughing at something I'd said, the sun coming down on both of us exactly like this. I held that image as long as I could, because I knew what was coming next. I had seen enough of Vanessa in the last 5 days to know that a woman like her did not leave a room like this and simply accept what she'd been given. She had an attorney beside her and a fighter's instinct, and probably enough resources to wage a legal battle that could stretch on for years. My son had tried to protect me from that. Calloway had said so. The capacity evaluation, the independent witnesses, the deliberate preparation. Daniel had known her too. But knowing a storm is coming and standing in it are two different things. I stood up when Calloway indicated the formal portion of the reading was concluded. I shook his hand. I thanked him. I picked up my purse with Daniel's letter inside it, and I walked toward the door. Evelyn. I stopped. Turned. Vanessa was still sitting at the table. Her attorney was beside her with his hand on the folder in front of him. She was looking at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Something complicated, some mixture of fury and grief, and something underneath both of those that was maybe closer to shame. "This isn't over," she said. Her voice was quiet now, controlled again, the performance coming back up like a shield being raised. I looked at her for a moment. "I know," I said. I walked out of the office and into the hallway and pressed the elevator button and stood there watching the floor numbers change. And I put my hand in my coat pocket and felt the edge of Daniel's photograph through my fingers. And I thought, no, it's not over. But something had changed in that room that could not be unchanged. Daniel had spoken. From whatever was left of him in 14 months of careful legal preparation, he had spoken. And no one in that room, not her attorney, and not her fury, and not all the money she intended to throw at the problem, could take back what had been said. The elevator opened. I stepped in. The doors closed behind me, and for the first time since I had boarded a plane in Texas 6 days ago, I was completely alone in a quiet space, and I let myself feel the full impossible weight of all of it. The loss, the love, the letter, the years we'd wasted, the years I still had left to live differently. I rode down in silence. When the doors opened on the ground floor, I walked out into the California sunlight, and I stood on the sidewalk and I breathed. And then I called Ruth. Ruth cried when I told her. Not the polite kind of crying, the kind where someone presses a hand to their mouth and composes themselves quickly. The real kind. The sudden, surprised kind that comes when something hits you before you've had time to brace for it. I was standing on a sidewalk in Palo Alto in the October sunshine with my purse over my arm and Daniel's letter inside it, and Ruth was 3 states away in Larkspur, sitting at her kitchen table, and she cried. "Evelyn," she kept saying. "Evelyn, that boy." "I know," I said. "He never forgot you, not for one single day." "I know," I said again, and my voice broke on it the second time in a way it hadn't the first time. The way emotion does when you give it one small opening. We talked for 20 minutes on that sidewalk. People moved around me. Professionals with coffee cups, a woman with a stroller, a delivery person on a bicycle. And none of them knew or cared that the older woman standing near the building entrance had just had her entire understanding of the last 10 years rearranged in a conference room upstairs. That's the thing about enormous moments. The world doesn't pause for them. You have to carry them around in your regular body while the regular world keeps moving. Ruth asked me what I was going to do. "Come home," I said. "First thing tomorrow." "And then?" "And then I don't know," I said honestly. "I imagine Vanessa is going to make this complicated." "Let her try," Ruth said, with a fierceness that surprised me and made me love her more than I already did. "Let her try, Evelyn. Daniel made his wishes clear, and he did it right, from what you're telling me, and she's not going to undo that." I wanted to believe her. I did believe her, in the abstract, in the way you believe things before they've been tested. But I had looked at Vanessa's face when she said this isn't over, and I had heard the quality of stillness in her attorney's silence, and I knew that belief and reality were about to spend some time getting acquainted with each other. I went back to the estate one last time to get my suitcase. The house felt different when I walked in. Not physically different. Everything was exactly where it had been. The art on the walls, the expensive furniture, the fresh flowers that staff replaced on a schedule. But the atmosphere had shifted in some way I felt before I could name it. Like pressure before a weather change. Lily was in the kitchen when I passed through. She looked up and something in her face told me she already knew, or sensed, that something had happened. Staff in a house like that develop a sensitivity to shifts in the emotional climate. You have to survive working that close to other people's lives. "Are you leaving?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning," I said. "I'm going to pack tonight." She nodded slowly, then, "Mrs. Harper, I hope it works out, whatever comes next." "Thank you, Lily," I said. "Take care of yourself." I went upstairs. I packed my small suitcase carefully, the way I always pack. Everything folded, nothing wasted. I put Daniel's photograph in the outer pocket where it had ridden all the way from Texas. I sat on the edge of the bed one last time and looked around the room and thought about all the nights I had lain awake in it, all the mornings I had stood at that window looking at the designed garden. I took nothing that wasn't mine. I left the room as I found it, the expensive linen smooth, the curtains straight.
Vanessa did not come upstairs. I did not go looking for her. I booked my flight home and I ate dinner alone in the kitchen, and I went to bed at 9 o'clock and slept, for the first time all week, without waking until morning.
The first legal document arrived 11 days after I got back to Larkspur. I had been home long enough to settle back into my routine: the garden, the coffee, Ruth coming over on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, the particular quiet of a house that was mine in every small inch of it. Long enough to take Daniel's photograph out of the suitcase pocket and put it back on the mantel in the living room where it had always lived. Long enough to read his letter 4 more times in private and to fold it carefully and put it in the box where I kept important things, alongside Harold's death certificate and Daniel's first-grade report card, and a handful of other items that constituted the documentary evidence of a life. Then the envelope came. It was from the law offices of a firm I didn't recognize. Not Callaway, a different one, bigger by the look of the letterhead, the kind of firm with 4 surnames and offices in 3 cities. The letter inside was dense with legal language that I read 3 times before the meaning became clear enough to hold on to. Vanessa Claire Harper, through her legal representatives, was filing a formal challenge to the last will and testament of Daniel Marcus Harper, on the grounds of undue influence and questions regarding the testator's mental capacity at the time of execution. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time with that letter in front of me. Undue influence, which meant me, which meant the allegation was that I had somehow manipulated my son into rewriting his will in my favor. I, who had not been inside his home until the week he was buried, who had spoken to him by phone a handful of times in the last 2 years, who had not known the name of his estate attorney until I overheard a hallway conversation. I called Callaway's office. Sandra, the paralegal, was expecting my call. "We received notice this morning as well," she said. "Mr. Callaway would like to meet with you this week if possible. He anticipated this outcome, Mrs. Harper. Daniel did too, which is why the documentation was prepared as carefully as it was." "What does this mean for me?" I asked. "Practically. It means there will be a legal process," she said. "It could take some time, but the position of the estate is strong, very strong." Strong was not the same as certain. I knew that even before I understood much else about law. Strong meant there was still a fight to be had, just one that was more likely to go in a particular direction. It didn't mean Vanessa was going to simply give up and walk away. I had sat across from that woman for a week. I knew better than to expect her to walk away. I flew back to California 4 days later to meet with Callaway in person. This time I stayed in a hotel, a modest one, the kind I was used to, with a coffee maker on the dresser and a window that looked out over a parking lot. It was fine. It was more than fine. It felt more like myself than any room in that Hillborough estate had ever managed to. Callaway was thorough and calm and made me feel, without ever saying anything falsely reassuring, that he understood exactly what was at stake and had prepared for precisely this. He walked me through the documentation Daniel had assembled, the will itself, witnessed by 2 attorneys with no connection to either Vanessa or to me, the letter, which was part of the legal record, and one other thing I hadn't known about. Daniel recorded a video statement, Callaway said, 6 weeks before he died. He came into this office specifically for that purpose. He spoke for approximately 20 minutes, on camera, witnessed and notarized, addressing the distribution of his estate and his reasoning for each decision. I looked at him. "Can I see it?" He turned his laptop toward me. The video was shot simply. Daniel sitting in this same office, in natural light, in a blue shirt I didn't recognize. He looked tired, I noticed first. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there in the last photographs I'd seen of him, and he'd lost some weight since his wedding photographs. And he sat in the chair with the particular stillness of someone who has decided something difficult and made peace with the difficulty of it. He spoke clearly. He stated his name, the date, his understanding of the proceedings. He confirmed that he was under no coercion, that he had reviewed the terms of his will with independent counsel, that the decisions therein were entirely his own. And then he said, "I want to address specifically the bequest to my mother, Evelyn May Harper, because I understand it may be questioned. My mother has had no meaningful involvement in my financial affairs. She has exerted no influence over this decision. The decision is mine alone, made over a period of years of reflection, and it is the decision I most wanted to get right. He paused there, just a few seconds. He pressed his lips together briefly, and then continued. I was not a good son in the ways that would have been easiest for her to measure. I was not present. I let distance become habit. I made choices that prioritized other things over the relationship I had with the woman who raised me, and I can't undo those years. What I can do is make sure that she is provided for in the years she has left, and that she knows that there is a permanent record of the fact that she was loved, not because she asked for it. She never asked for anything. That's exactly the point. He looked directly into the camera. She taught me what love actually looks like, he said. It looks like someone who keeps showing up even when you give them very little reason to. I hope she can forgive me for making her work so hard at it. Calloway closed the laptop. I sat in the chair in his office, and I didn't try to manage what was happening on my face. He came in specifically to make that, I said. Yes, Calloway said. He told me he wanted to make it very difficult for anyone to question your integrity. Those were his words. Very difficult. Even at the end, he was trying to protect me from something he knew was coming, from something I hadn't even imagined yet. The legal process moved the way legal processes do, slowly, unevenly, with bursts of activity followed by stretches of waiting that were their own particular kind of exhausting. Vanessa's attorneys filed their challenge formally. Calloway's office responded. Depositions were scheduled. Experts were engaged. The machinery of it was impersonal and enormous and had a logic entirely its own that had nothing to do with grief or love or what anyone felt about anything. I went home to Larkspur in between and tried to live my regular life. I pulled weeds. I had Ruth over for coffee. I drove out to visit Harold's grave on Sundays the way I always had, and I sat there for a while each time and talked to him the way I talked to Daniel's photograph, which is to say, I said whatever needed saying to someone who couldn't answer back but who felt present anyway, in the way of people who mattered. The hard days were the ones when the doubt crept in. Not doubt about Daniel. The letter and the video had answered that question in a way I could live with, had answered it so completely that I was sometimes overwhelmed all over again just thinking about it. But doubt about whether I had the right to fight for this. Whether a woman from a small town in Texas with a garden and a modest house and a history of making do with very little was the right vessel for $30 million worth of her son's life work. Whether Daniel had thought clearly about what he was putting me through by giving me this particular inheritance. I said something like that to Calloway once, when I was having a hard week and wasn't guarding my thoughts carefully enough. He looked at me over his glasses with the expression of a man who had heard a great many things across his desk over the years. He thought about it more carefully than almost any testator I've worked with, he said. He knew you'd question it. I think he thought you would. I think that's partially why he made the video. That helped. Not entirely, but enough. The first deposition was in December, 8 weeks after the will reading. I had to answer questions about my relationship with Daniel, my contact with him over the years, my awareness of his estate plans. Vanessa's attorney was a man named Driscoll, the silver-haired one who had sat beside her in Calloway's office. And he asked his questions with the careful precision of someone trying to build something out of small pieces, looking for any crack he could find to insert a wedge. Had I pressured Daniel to change his will? No. Had I asked him for money at any point in the last 5 years? No. Had I been aware of the approximate value of his estate before the reading? No. Had I discussed my financial situation with Daniel? I had to think about that one. Once, I said. 2 years ago, when the roof needed work, Daniel had asked how I was getting on, and I'd mentioned it might be a difficult expense. He had offered to help. I had said no. Driscoll paused on that. He offered money, and you declined. Yes. Why? I looked at him. Because I didn't want his money. I wanted to talk to him. Driscoll made a note. I couldn't tell if he was satisfied with the answer or troubled by it, but I noticed him moving on quickly, which I had come to understand meant he wasn't finding the foundation he was looking for. The deposition lasted 4 hours. I was more tired at the end of it than I'd been after any physical work I could remember, because sustained vigilance of that kind takes something out of you that sleep doesn't easily put back. But I had answered every question honestly, which meant I hadn't had to think about what I was saying, only about saying it clearly. That matters in situations like that. Having only one version of the truth is a significant advantage over someone working with something more complicated. Vanessa's deposition was scheduled for January. I was not present for it. I learned about what happened there through Calloway and later through the court documents that became part of the record. What I can tell you is what those documents showed and what the attorneys who were present described in terms that managed to be both clinical and quietly devastating. Vanessa had been asked to describe her relationship with Daniel over the course of their marriage. She described it as close, strong, untroubled by significant conflict. She was then presented with a series of emails. Daniel had kept copies of correspondence, organized, dated, stored with Calloway's office in a sealed file that Calloway had not opened until instructed to do so after the will challenge was filed. 14 months' worth of email exchanges between Daniel and various parties, including his personal therapist, a financial advisor who was not Gregory, and 3 close friends. The emails were not dramatic. They were not angry or accusatory, but taken together they painted a picture of a man who had been aware for some time that his marriage had become primarily a financial arrangement, and who had made decisions about his estate based partly on what he understood that to mean. In one email to a friend, dated 8 months before he died, Daniel had written, "I've been thinking about Mom a lot, about the years I let go by. I keep telling myself I'll address it when things are less complicated, but I'm starting to understand that less complicated isn't coming. It's always going to be complicated. I think I need to do something while I still can." Vanessa's attorneys had not known about the emails. That was clear from the deposition record. The discovery of them shifted something in the proceedings that I could feel even from a distance, reading the documents in Calloway's office on a cold January afternoon. Calloway set the papers down and looked at me. "She's going to have a problem," he said simply. "What?" "February brought 2 things: a cold snap in Larkspur that killed 2 of Harold's roses, and a call from Calloway that the judge had agreed to an expedited hearing on the preliminary motions, which meant we would be in front of an actual judge sooner than Vanessa's team had likely intended, and that the court was going to take an early look at the overall strength of the challenge before committing to a full trial. I did not sleep well the week before the hearing, not because I was afraid exactly, but because anxiety doesn't always need fear as its source. Sometimes it's just the accumulated weight of something unresolved pressing against you from the inside, looking for somewhere to go. Ruth drove me to the airport. "You're going to be fine," she said at the departure gate. "You keep saying that," I said. "Because it keeps being true," she said, and hugged me in the fierce, practical way she hugged people, like she was trying to press the certainty directly into you. The hearing was in a courthouse in San Jose. I wore the black dress again, the same one I'd worn to Daniel's funeral, which struck me as appropriate in a way I didn't try to explain. Calloway met me outside and we walked in together, and I was grateful for his steadiness beside me, the unhurried quality of him, the sense that he had done this 100 times and was not surprised by any of it. Vanessa was already inside with Driscoll and a second attorney I hadn't seen before. She was dressed in charcoal gray, which was different from the black of the funeral week, and she looked thinner, harder around the edges in a way that might have been resolve or might have been strain or might have been both. When she saw me, she looked for a moment like she was going to say something, and then she turned away. The judge was a woman named Honorable Patricia Osei, compact, direct, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the unhurried authority of someone who had been sorting out other people's worst moments for a long time. She reviewed the preliminary filings quickly and asked several questions of both sides, and I sat in my chair and watched her face and tried to read it and couldn't. Then she said she wanted to review Daniel's video statement in chambers. They recessed for 40 minutes. I sat in the hallway with Calloway on a wooden bench and drank bad coffee from a vending machine and watched people move through the courthouse on their own business. Lawyers with rolling carts of documents, a family clutching each other near an elevator, a man in a security uniform eating a sandwich. The ordinary cathedral of other people's difficult days. When we reconvened, the judge set down her glasses and addressed the room with the directness of someone who had made up her mind and was not going to use more words than necessary to say so. The challenge, she said, was not supported by evidence sufficient to warrant a full trial. The documented preparation of the will, independent witnesses, legal review, and most significantly the video statement, which she described as among the most clear and deliberate she had encountered in a case of this nature, established beyond reasonable question that the testator had been of sound mind, free of external coercion, and fully aware of his decisions and their implications. She was not ruling on the entire challenge, she clarified. There were procedural matters that would require resolution. But she was ruling on the preliminary question of whether there was sufficient basis to freeze the estate assets pending litigation. There was not. The estate, she ruled, would proceed to probate under the terms of the will as written. Driscoll was already on his feet with an objection before she finished the sentence. She looked at him with the patience of someone who expected exactly this. "Mr. Driscoll," she said, "you're welcome to continue your challenge through appropriate channels. I'm ruling on the preliminary motion. Sit down." He sat. I looked at my hands in my lap. They were trembling, I noticed. Not much, just slightly, the way hands do when they've been holding tension for too long and the tension has somewhere to go. Calloway put his hand briefly on my arm. Outside the courthouse, in the thin February sunshine, he gave me a realistic picture of what came next. Vanessa could continue to pursue the challenge through an appeal process. It would cost her money and time, and the ruling today had weakened her position significantly, but she had resources, and she had Driscoll, and she had the particular motivation of someone who had built an identity around a certain outcome and was not ready to relinquish it. "How long?" I asked. "Could be another 6 months," he said. "Could be less if her team advises her that the cost-benefit analysis isn't in her favor. And if she keeps going regardless of what they advise?" He was quiet for a moment, honest in the way I'd come to appreciate about him. "Then we keep going too," he said, "and we'll win. It'll just take longer." I nodded. The sun was cold and direct on my face, and I tilted up toward it the way you do when you've been inside a courthouse for hours and the light feels like something you'd forgotten existed. "She's not going to stop," I said. It wasn't a question. "Probably not immediately," he said. "Then we keep going." I meant it too. Not with heat, not with anything that felt like triumph or revenge. Those would have been easier emotions to carry, in a way, cleaner. What I felt was something more like the tired, rooted stubbornness of someone who had decided years ago, standing on a back porch with the phone against her chest and her gardening gloves still on, that she was not going to be made into nothing. Daniel had seen that in me. He had counted on it. He had written it into the record 14 months ago in Calloway's office, while he still could. The least I could do was be worth that bet. Well, the appeal Vanessa filed in March was more aggressive than the preliminary challenge. Driscoll had brought in a specialist, a woman named Hargrove, who worked specifically in contested estate cases, sharp and meticulous, and whose reputation Calloway described to me without embellishment as formidable. Hargrove's approach was different from Driscoll's. Where Driscoll had focused on the process of the will's execution, trying to find cracks in the documentation, Hargrove focused on the relationship itself. She subpoenaed phone records. She tracked the frequency of calls between Daniel and me over the last 5 years. She interviewed Patricia, whose name I had mentioned in my deposition, without quite understanding what that might lead to. She interviewed Lily, the household employee. She found the woman at the funeral reception who had been surprised to learn Daniel had a mother. She was trying to construct a portrait of absence, a son and mother who had drifted irreparably apart, whose relationship was too thin and too distant to have motivated the decision Daniel had made. It was a strategy, I understood. A reasonable one, even. If you could demonstrate that the relationship was functionally non-existent, you could argue more plausibly that the bequest was anomalous, a product of something other than genuine feeling. What she hadn't counted on was the emails. The emails Daniel had kept, the ones Vanessa's team hadn't known about, included several that mentioned me specifically. Not in grand terms, not in the language of dramatic declaration, but in the ordinary private way people talk about the people they love when they think no one is keeping a record. The preserves, the phone calls. A message to his therapist about a dream he'd had in which he was back in the Larkspur house as a child, and his mother was in the garden, and when he walked toward her she didn't seem to see him, and how he had woken up from it with a feeling he couldn't shake. His therapist had provided a statement, not about the dream specifically, which was protected, but about Daniel's general state of mind in their sessions during the period the will was executed, and whether his decision-making capacity and emotional clarity had been compromised in any way she had observed. It had not. That was her professional opinion. His reasoning about family relationships, about what he owed and what he wanted and what he intended, had been lucid, sustained, and consistent across many sessions. She had never had cause for concern. Hargrove fought hard, but the record was what it was. In April, at a second hearing before Judge Osei, who by this point gave the impression of someone who had assessed the architecture of this case and found it structurally settled, the appeal was denied on every substantive point. Hargrove requested additional time to prepare supplementary motions. Judge Osei granted a 60-day extension and looked at both tables with the expression of a woman who had been patient as long as patience served a purpose and was beginning to form a view about its limits. Those 60 days were the strangest of the whole process for me. The legal machinery was still running, but at a slower pace, and I was back in Larkspur with very little to do but wait and continue living. I planted new roses, 2 of them, to replace the ones the cold snap had killed. I repainted the porch railing, which had been flaking since the previous autumn, and which I'd been putting off. I drove out to Harold's grave and sat for a while and talked. I told him about all of it, the house and the corkboard and the letter. The video Daniel had made, looking directly into the camera with tired eyes and a blue shirt, the hearing and the judge, and the way Calloway had briefly touched my arm when the ruling was read. I told him that Daniel had loved us, both of us. That even through all the years of distance, he had loved the place he came from and the people who had made him. I sat there in the April sunshine with the Texas sage rustling near Harold's marker, and I thought about the fact that the world had a way of revealing what mattered, eventually, if you were patient enough and stubborn enough and present enough to receive it. I was not a patient woman by nature. Ruth would confirm that. But I had learned, over 72 years, the difference between waiting because you are passive and waiting because you understand that some things cannot be hurried. Calloway called on a Thursday morning in early May. "It's over," he said. I sat down at the kitchen table. Hargrove advised Vanessa that the supplementary motion had no viable pathway to success, he said. The evidentiary record is too strong, and the judge has signaled clearly enough that further delay would be viewed unfavorably. They've withdrawn the challenge. I held the phone. "Evelyn," Calloway said, with more warmth than I had heard from him in all the months of working together, which is to say, a measured but genuine amount of warmth. "The estate will now proceed to full probate under the terms of Daniel's will. I expect the process to be complete within 4 to 6 months. There's a great deal to administer, and we'll go through it carefully and thoroughly, but the legal question is settled." "She's really stopping," I said. "She's stopping." I thanked him and set the phone down on the table and sat in my kitchen in the house Harold had bought in 1978, and I listened to the quiet of it, the refrigerator hum, the birds outside, the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower, the sounds of an ordinary Thursday morning in a life that was, in the most ordinary and irreducible sense, mine. I thought about Daniel making that video, sitting in Calloway's office in his blue shirt with his tired eyes, looking into the camera and saying, "I wanted to make it very difficult for anyone to question your integrity. He had given me more than money. He had built me a fortress and stocked it with the most powerful weapon available, the truth, and the truth had held." I got up and put the kettle on because it was 10 in the morning and I had been waiting for this call for 7 months, and I wanted a cup of tea, and sometimes the most important thing you can do after the ground stops shaking is simply make yourself a cup of tea and let yourself stand still for a minute in the quiet of a life that is still going. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the garden while the kettle heated. The new roses were coming in. Small, not much yet, just the beginning of what they were going to be. But they were there, and they were growing, and they had decided entirely on their own that this was a reasonable place to put down roots. I thought that was about right. The probate process took 5 months and 3 weeks. I know that sounds like a long time, and in some ways it was. 5 months of paperwork and phone calls and flying back to California twice more to meet with Calloway and accountants and business advisors and people who used words I had to ask them to repeat and explain more than once. And I was not embarrassed about that. Not anymore. I had stopped being embarrassed about what I didn't know somewhere around the 3rd month. when I realized that not knowing something and being unwilling to learn it are two entirely different conditions, and I only had one of them. Calloway was patient, more patient than I deserved probably, on the days when I called him with questions that were probably covered in documents he had already sent me. He answered everything. He had a paralegal, a different one now, a young man named Marcus who had the gift of explaining complicated things in plain language without making you feel condescended to, who put together summaries for me after each major development, written in the kind of English that a person could actually read on a Tuesday morning at a kitchen table in Larkspur, Texas, without a law degree. I learned things about my son's life that I had not known. The scope of what he had built was larger than I had understood even from the will reading. There were investments in 7 companies, 2 of which he had co-founded. There was commercial real estate in San Jose and in Austin. Austin, which made me stop and sit with the document for a moment, because Austin was where Daniel had had his first apartment, the one from which he had called me at 11 o'clock to say the pot roast had come out right. He had gone back there, financially at least, at some point in the years between. He had put roots in the city where he'd first tried to be an adult. I didn't know whether that meant something or whether I was making meaning where there was only coincidence, but I kept thinking about it anyway. The charitable trust he had established separately, the one Calloway had mentioned at the will reading as already operational and not subject to the proceedings, was focused on literacy programs for children in underserved communities. It had been running for 3 years. It served programs in 4 states. There was a small plaque in the offices of one of the nonprofits it funded that said, in plain letters, "In honor of a mother who read to me every night." Calloway showed me a photograph of it. I had to leave the room for a few minutes. I sat in the hallway outside Calloway's office on a hard chair with my hands pressed together between my knees, and I thought about the years Daniel was in elementary school, when money was tight in the way that it is tight when it is the only thing you think about. And Harold was working long hours, and I was working part-time at the school, and we were keeping everything together with the particular fierce and quiet determination of people who do not have the option of not keeping everything together. And every night, no matter how tired I was, I read to Daniel. We went through picture books and chapter books, and eventually novels he was too young for technically, but that he followed perfectly well because he was that kind of child, the kind that leans toward difficulty and trusts himself to manage it. He had remembered that. He had built something around it, something that was still running after he was gone, still sending books into the hands of children who needed them, still doing quietly in the world the thing he had decided mattered. I went back into Calloway's office, and I told Marcus I was going to need a moment before we continued, and he nodded and brought me a glass of water without being asked, and we sat in the good silence of people who understand that some things don't need filling. Maton. The final transfer of assets was completed on a Thursday in October, almost exactly 1 year after I had received that phone call in my garden with my gloves still on. I was in Larkspur when Calloway called to confirm it. I was in the garden, as a matter of fact. Not pulling weeds this time, planting. Ruth had brought me a flat of late-season marigolds that she'd grown from seed, the orange ones that Harold had always liked because he said they looked like they were arguing with the light. I had dirt under my fingernails when the phone rang. "It's done," Calloway said. "Congratulations, Evelyn, though I know that word is complicated in the circumstances." "It is," I said, "but thank you for everything." "Daniel did the work," he said. "I just kept the record." After I hung up, I stayed in the garden for a while. The marigolds needed to go in before the weather turned, and I had 3 more to plant, and I did it carefully, taking my time, pressing each one into the soil the way Harold had taught me to. Not just into the hole, but firmed around the roots so they knew they were held. Ruth came outside from the kitchen where she'd been making coffee and stood on the back porch. "Was that Calloway?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "And?" "It's done." She let out a long breath, not quite a word, something that had been held for a long time releasing. "Come inside," she said. "Coffee's ready." I took off my gloves and went inside, and we sat at the kitchen table with our coffee, and we didn't make any speeches about it,
didn't mark the moment with anything more elaborate than sitting together in my kitchen the way we had been sitting together in kitchens for 40 years, and I think that was exactly right. Some moments don't want ceremony. Some moments just want to be allowed to be what they are. The first thing I did with the money was fix the porch. I know that sounds absurd. I know that a woman who has just completed probate on a $30 million estate could do rather more dramatic things than fix a leaning porch on a small brick house in rural Texas. Ruth told me as much, gently, when I told her my immediate plan. "Evelyn," she said, "you could buy a new house." "I don't want a new house," I said. "I want this house, with a porch that doesn't lean." She looked at me for a moment, then she laughed, the real kind, and said, "Fair enough." The porch took 3 days and cost about $4,000, which I paid for from a regular account without drama or fanfare. The contractor was a young man from town who did good work and didn't ask too many questions, and when he was done, the porch was level and solid and looked like it was going to outlast the house around it, which was about all I'd asked for. Then I thought about what came next. I had spent 7 months in legal proceedings and 5 months in probate, and somewhere in the middle of all of that I had made a decision that I had been carrying quietly, not talking about, not yet, because I wanted to be certain of it before I said it out loud, the way you want to be certain of something important before you put it where other people can see it and have opinions about it. What I had decided was this: I was not going to change my life in the ways that people expected me to change it. I was not going to move to a larger house in a different city, or buy expensive things, or hire staff, or become, in any measurable external way, a different version of who I already was. Not because I thought there was virtue in refusing comfort. I had never believed that suffering makes you better, and I was not interested in the performance of sacrifice for its own sake, but because I had spent 72 years being exactly who I was, and that person had been enough for Daniel, and she was enough for me. What I was going to do was use what he had given me to do the things that mattered. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, a real one, spiral bound, the kind I'd always used for grocery lists and household notes, and I wrote it all down. Not a business plan, not a formal document, just a list, in my own handwriting, of the things I wanted to do with my son's inheritance, the things I thought he would recognize as coming from the same place he had come from. The Literacy Trust was the first thing. I contacted the foundation that administered Daniel's charitable trust, and I spoke with a woman named Dr. Agatha Rowe, who ran it, and I told her I wanted to significantly expand its reach. She asked me what I had in mind. I told her I wanted to fund 10 new program sites in communities that had been on the wait list, and I wanted to create a scholarship program attached to it for children who came through the literacy programs and showed particular academic promise. She was quiet for a moment. "That would be transformative," she said. "Then let's do it," I said. We worked together for 3 months on the details. Marcus from Callaway's office helped me navigate the legal and financial structure. Ruth came with me to one of the program sites, a school library in a small town 2 hours from Larkspur, and we watched a group of 8-year-olds with a reading specialist, and I sat in a small plastic chair meant for someone half my size and watched those children with their books, and I thought, Daniel sent books into this room. Not metaphorically. His money had paid for those books and that specialist and that hour on that Tuesday afternoon. And the children didn't know that and didn't need to, but I knew it, and it sat warm in me the whole drive home. The second thing on my list was Harold's grave. I arranged for a proper restoration of the marker, which had weathered over the years to a roughness that bothered me more than I had admitted. New stone. His name and dates, and a simple line that I chose myself. He loved his family well. I had the grounds around it landscaped. Not elaborately, nothing that wouldn't belong in a Texas cemetery, but properly, with something permanent and cared for about it. And I arranged with the cemetery for ongoing maintenance, paid years in advance, so that the care of it would not depend on my being able to get out there every season. Daniel was in a California cemetery that I could not easily visit. Harold was in Texas. They were both outside my daily reach, and that was a grief I would live with. But I could at least make sure Harold's place in the ground was tended in a way he would have approved of. Simple, solid, without pretension. The third thing took me longer to decide, because it was the most personal and the one I was least sure about. Daniel had commercial real estate in Austin,
a building primarily occupied by small businesses and a floor of office space. Callaway's team had given me options: sell it, hold it, develop it. I sat with those options for several weeks, and then I called Callaway and said I wanted to do something different. I wanted to convert one floor of that Austin building into affordable workspace for small nonprofits and community organizations. I wanted to name it, and I wanted to name it something I had thought about carefully. I named it the Harold and Daniel Harper Community Center. Not a grand statement, not a monument. Just a floor in a building in Austin where people doing good work could afford to operate, with two names above the door that meant everything to me and would mean nothing to most people who walked past. And that was exactly right. The meaning wasn't for the passers-by. It was for me, and for the memory of the two men I had loved longest and lost, and for whatever version of continuity you can build out of what the dead leave behind. Callaway told me later that when the renovation was complete and the first tenants moved in, one of them, a young woman running a food assistance nonprofit, had asked the building manager about the name above the door. The manager had told her the basics: two men, father and son, from Texas and California. The woman had nodded and said something that the manager had passed along to Callaway, who passed it along to me. She had said, "Someone must have loved them very much." I read that in an email on a Tuesday afternoon in Larkspur, and I had to put the laptop down and go outside for a while. There are things I did not do in the year that followed that I want to be honest about. I did not become a generous and peaceful person overnight. I did not arrive at some elevated state of forgiveness and calm that made the previous year seem like a lesson cleanly learned. I had nights when I lay awake thinking about the things Vanessa had said at the viewing. She was never a significant presence in his life, and something in me would tighten with an anger that I hadn't fully processed, and maybe still haven't. I had days when I was short with Ruth for no good reason and had to apologize for it afterward. I had a week in February when I didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to be useful or purposeful or moving forward, and I just sat in the house and watched television and ate cereal for dinner 3 nights running and felt the weight of everything that the year had held. Grief doesn't have a timeline. I think people want it to, want there to be a point at which you've done it correctly and can move into whatever comes next with a sense of completion. But loss doesn't work that way, and anyone who tells you it does is selling something. You just carry it differently as time goes on. It gets less sharp and more settled, like a stone that's been worn smooth. It's still there, still heavy, but you've learned the shape of it and you don't cut yourself on it as often. I miss Daniel in the particular way you miss someone you had unfinished business with. Not the frantic, desperate grief of sudden loss, which was its own thing and had its own season, but the longer, quieter grief of understanding that the conversation you always meant to have is permanently postponed. I knew more about my son than I had when I boarded that plane to California, more about the man he had been, the choices he had made, the ways he had thought about me when he thought I wasn't watching. But knowing and talking are not the same thing, and there were mornings when I would have given a great deal just to have the phone ring and hear his voice. I'm telling you this because I think the truth of it matters more than the tidy version. Oh, I heard from Vanessa once more. It was late November, about 14 months after Daniel died. I was in the kitchen making soup, the actual work of making soup, the kind that takes most of an afternoon and smells like a house becoming a home, and my phone rang with a California number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it. When I did, there was a pause before she spoke, long enough that I had time to recognize the quality of it. Not a technical pause, a human one, the kind where someone has gathered themselves to the edge of saying something difficult and is making the final decision. "Evelyn," she said. I stopped stirring the soup. "Vanessa," I said. Another pause. When she spoke again, her voice was different from every version of it I had heard that week in California. Not the social performance, not the controlled precision, not even the raw fury of the conference room. It was smaller, more tired. "I'm not calling to start anything," she said. "I want you to know that up front." "All right," I said. I had to move out of the house." A short pause. "The Hillborough house. I have the settlement and I kept a few things, but I didn't want to stay there. I'm in San Francisco now." I didn't know what she wanted me to say to that, so I said nothing. "I've been seeing someone," she said. "A therapist. She's made me look at some things I didn't particularly want to look at." Another pause, longer. She asked me to think about whether there was anything I needed to say to people before I could move forward, and I've been arguing with her about this particular one for about 2 months. "And you decided to call," I said. "I decided to call," she said. The kitchen smelled like soup, and the afternoon light was coming in at the low winter angle, and I waited. "I knew that he loved you," she said. "I think I always knew that. Even when I told myself differently and told other people differently, I knew. And I spent a lot of years. I spent a lot of energy." She stopped, started again. "I told myself that what I was doing made sense because he had this whole life that had nothing to do with where he came from, and that was true. His life had changed enormously, but that wasn't what I was actually protecting. I was protecting, I don't know exactly, my position, I suppose. The story I needed to be true about what we had." I stood at the stove with the wooden spoon in my hand. "I'm not asking for anything," she said. "I know I'm not entitled to anything from you. My therapist says I need to stop carrying things I haven't put down properly, and this is one of them." A pause. "I was cruel to you that week. I said things about you that weren't true, and you were there to bury your son, and I made it harder than it needed to be, and I'm sorry for that." The silence that followed was the longest of the conversation. I want to be honest about what I felt in it, because I owe you that. I did not feel magnanimous. I did not feel the clean, generous swell of a person rising above injury. I felt tired. I felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has finally been offered the chance to set it down, but has to first acknowledge how heavy it was. "I know you loved him too," I said. It cost me something to say it. I said it anyway because it was true and because I had learned over 72 years that carrying the wrong version of a story is its own kind of punishment, and I didn't want to do it. She made a sound that was close to something breaking and then containing itself. She started and couldn't finish. "I know," I said. We were quiet together on the phone for a moment. Two women who had loved the same man imperfectly and lost him completely, standing on opposite sides of a country with nothing left to fight over. "Take care of yourself," I said finally. "You too," she said. She hung up. I stood at the stove for a long time after. The soup was simmering. The kitchen smelled right. I picked up the wooden spoon and kept going. I did not call her back. I did not feel that we were reconciled in any meaningful sense, and I think pretending otherwise would have been a kindness to neither of us. What we had was something smaller than reconciliation and larger than nothing. I saw it, an acknowledgement, a laying down of particular weapons, a recognition that the person on the other side of the phone was a human being who had made choices in fear and grief and self-preservation, the way human beings do, and that understanding that fact was not the same as excusing the choices. I can hold both of those things at once now. That took time to learn. There is something I want to tell you, Tuck, directly. The way I have been trying to tell this whole story, without decoration and without the pretense that I arrived at any of this wisdom easily or without cost. I was 72 years old when my son died. I had a leaning porch and a small house and a garden and a neighbor who was also my best friend and a box of important papers that included a first-grade report card and a man's death certificate. That was the sum of my visible life, and I had made my peace with it, or thought I had. What I had not made peace with, what I had been quietly not thinking about for years, the way you quietly not think about something that hurts too much to look at directly, was the distance from Daniel, the calls that got shorter, the Christmases I spent in Texas because the invitation to California never quite materialized, the slow erasure of myself from my son's daily life, year by year, conducted so smoothly and by such small increments that I had almost convinced myself it was natural, normal, the inevitable consequence of children growing into their own worlds. It was not natural. I know that now. I knew it then, I think, somewhere below the level of admission. What I could not find for years was the courage to name it clearly and push back against it. I told myself, he's busy, he's building something, don't be a burden. Don't ask for more than is offered. That is what women of my generation were taught. Don't ask for more than is offered. Make do with what you're given. Love silently and without expectation, because love that comes with expectation is really just a transaction in disguise. There is truth in that somewhere. Love that comes with conditions is something other than love. But here's what I had confused for years. Expecting to matter to your own child is not a condition. It is not a demand. It is a fact of relationship that deserves to be protected and named and sometimes, when necessary, fought for. Daniel left me his fortune because he loved me. But here's the thing I need you to hear, the thing that took me an entire year of grief and legal battles and quiet mornings in a garden to understand fully. He left it to me as an apology, a beautiful, generous, carefully constructed apology for the years he let the distance grow without fighting it. He knew it. He said it in his letter. I kept telling myself I'd fix it next year. He was trying, at the end, to do what he hadn't done while there was still time to do it differently. I don't want you to take the wrong lesson from this story. The lesson is not, if you are patient and silent and accepting enough, you will be rewarded in the end. That is not what I am saying. That would be the cruelest possible distortion of what happened to me, and I will not be part of telling it that way. The lesson is this: do not wait until the end. If you are being pushed out of a relationship that matters to you, not drifted from, not grown apart from, in the natural way of living, but systematically and deliberately edged toward the door by someone who has decided you are inconvenient, do not accept that as the way things are. Do not call it peace when it is really surrender. There is a difference between letting go of something that has run its course and being made to let go of something that is still alive, and you are allowed to know the difference, and you are allowed to hold on. If you are a mother watching your child drift away under the influence of someone who has decided you are a threat to their control of your child's life, name it. Not in accusation, not in warfare, but name it to yourself first, clearly, without the softening language of people who don't want to see what they're seeing. Name it and decide what you are willing to do about it, because the alternative is what happened to Daniel and me. Years of silence that neither of us really wanted, that both of us regretted, that could have been different if one of us had been braver sooner. He tried to make it right at the end. I am grateful for that, more than I have words for. But I would trade every dollar of that inheritance for one more Sunday phone call that lasted longer than it needed to, for one more Christmas invitation, for one more chance to sit across a table from my son while he was still in the room. Money cannot buy back time. I know that is not an original observation. I know you have heard it before, probably in precisely those words. But there is a difference between knowing a thing and knowing a thing. And I am telling you that I know it now in a way I did not know it before, in the part of me that is not abstract, the part that gets up in the morning and makes coffee and goes into the garden and lives. Don't wait. That is what I am telling you. Whatever conversation you have been putting off, whatever relationship you have been watching erode because the repair feels too hard or too awkward or too much to ask for, do not wait. Not for the right moment, not for the other person to make the first move. Not until things are less complicated. Things will not be less complicated. Make the call. Show up at the door. Say the things that need to be said while there is still someone on the other side to receive them. Daniel said, I kept telling myself I'd fix it next year. He ran out of next year's at 44. I was lucky enough to get the letter instead, the video, the inheritance. All his attempts to say from beyond what he hadn't managed to say when there was still breath in him to say it. But that was lucky, and luck is not a plan, and I would not wish on any of you the education of learning that lesson the hard way. It is spring now as I write this, almost 18 months since that October morning when the phone rang and my world split into before and after. The garden is coming in again. Harold's roses, the original ones, the ones that survived, are putting out new growth, and the two I planted after the cold snap are catching up, still behind, but gaining. The marigolds Ruth brought me last autumn didn't survive the winter, which was expected, but she's already started a new flat of them for this season, and she says they'll be ready in a few weeks. I had the kitchen repainted. Not a dramatic change. Same warm color, just fresher. I fixed the step on the back porch that had been loose for 3 years. I bought a new reading chair for the living room, the kind that's actually comfortable rather than merely decent, because I am 73 years old and I have earned a comfortable reading chair. The Daniel Harper wing of the Youth Literacy Program opened its first new site in March. Dr. Rowe sent me photographs.
A room full of books and small chairs and windows with good light. I look at those photographs sometimes when I'm sitting in my new reading chair in the evenings, and I feel something that I don't have a perfect word for. Not happiness exactly, which feels too simple, and not peace, which feels too complete, but something in between them. Something that keeps its feet on the ground and doesn't ask for more than what is real. Daniel's photograph is on the mantel. The one of him at 8 years old, missing his front tooth, grinning at something Harold was doing behind the camera. It has lived in this house his whole life, and it is going to keep living here. I talk to him sometimes when the house is quiet, and there is no one around to hear. I tell him about the programs, about the building in Austin, about what I'm growing in the garden. I tell him that Ruth brought more marigolds. I tell him I finally replaced the reading chair, and it's a good one. I tell him I forgive him for the years, and that I more than hope, I am as certain of it as I am of anything, that he knew even then, even in the middle of all the distance and the silence and the slow drift of years, that I never stopped loving him. Not for a single day, not for a single hour. That is the thing about a mother's love that people like Vanessa never understood, for all her observation of it from the outside. It does not require reciprocation to continue. It does not shrink in proportion to what is returned. It just persists stubbornly and sometimes painfully, the way Harold's roses persist, through drought and cold snap and seasons of neglect, putting out new growth year after year for no reason except that it is in their nature to grow. My son knew that about me. He knew it well enough to put a note on a corkboard and look at it every morning above his desk. He knew it well enough to sit in a lawyer's office in a blue shirt with tired eyes and say, on camera, for the permanent record, she was the one person who loved me before all of this. I was, I am, I will be. That is the whole of it, and it is enough. And I'm going to go outside now and see how the roses are doing in the morning light. And I'm going to think about my son, and I'm going to be grateful. Not for the money, not for the legal victory, not for any of the external machinery of this last year and a half, but for the note on the corkboard, for the proof that he saw me. For the knowledge that the love I sent across all those miles and all those years of silence landed somewhere, was received by someone, was kept. That knowledge is what I will carry for the rest of my life. Everything else is just roses.